June 15, 1785. Just 2 years after the Treaty of Paris officially ended the American Revolution, the United States was still a fragile experiment, 13 states, loosely held together under the Articles of Confederation, struggling to define what freedom meant in a land vast, wild, and full of uncertainty. But to the west of the Appalachian Mountains lay the Northwest Territory, a region stretching from the Ohio River to the Great Lakes, encompassing what would become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. This was America's frontier, fertile, rich in resources, and home to powerful native nations, the Shawnee, Miami, Delaware, Wyandot, and others, peoples who had lived and fought on this land long before the first colonial flag was ever raised. The revolution may have ended, but for control of the Northwest, another war was about to begin. The British had lost the Revolutionary War, yet they refused to truly leave North America. In violation of the peace treaty, British troops still occupied a chain of forts around the Great Lakes, from Detroit to Fort Niagara, claiming they were protecting their trade routes. In truth, these forts became supply lines for native resistance. British agents distributed guns and ammunition to the tribes of the Ohio Valley, urging them to hold the line against American expansion. For the native nations, the American settlers flooding across the Ohio River were not pioneers, they were invaders. To them, the new United States was just another empire, one that threatened to erase their lands and way of life. By 1785, native leaders from the Shawnee, Miami, Ottawa, and other tribes had joined an alliance known to Americans as the Western Confederacy. Their goal was simple: to stop the Americans from crossing the Ohio River. The first shots of this new war were fired in 1785 and 1786, as small skirmishes broke out between Americans. Washington, furious and humiliated, organized a second campaign in 1791 under Major General Arthur St. Clair, the governor of the Northwest Territory. St. Clair was an aging Revolutionary War veteran, but his army was even worse, a mix of untrained militia, raw recruits, and a few hundred regulars. As they marched north from Fort Washington, modern-day Cincinnati, disease, hunger, and desertion took their toll. By November, St. Clair's force numbered about 1,400 men. Then, on the cold morning of November 4, 1791, as the army camped near the Wabash River in present-day Ohio, the native Confederacy struck. Hundreds of warriors led by Little Turtle and Blue Jacket surrounded the camp and opened fire from the trees. The Americans panicked. The militia broke ranks and fled. Cannon crews were cut down before they could reload. The native warriors closed in with tomahawks and muskets in one of the most decisive indigenous victories in American history. In less than 3 hours, St. Clair's army was annihilated. Of his 1,400 men, more than 900 were killed or wounded, the worst defeat the U.S. Army would ever suffer at the hands of native forces. News of the disaster shocked the nation. President Washington, upon hearing of it, was said to have shouted in fury, "St. Clair shall have justice, but by God, he shall have justice." For Washington, the defeat was more than a military failure, it was an existential threat. If the United States could not defend its own borders, its authority and credibility as a nation would collapse. He turned to Henry Knox, his Secretary of War, and ordered the creation of a new, professional army. This would become the Legion of the United States, led by a hard, disciplined Revolutionary War hero, General Anthony Wayne, known to his men as Mad Anthony. Wayne was not reckless as his nickname suggested, he was methodical, organized, and determined to rebuild America's fighting force from. While Wayne trained, diplomats attempted one last effort to make peace. American envoys met with tribal leaders at Sandusky, offering terms of settlement. But the native Confederacy, encouraged by continued British support from Fort Miami, refused to yield. As spring of 1794 arrived, General Wayne marched deep into Ohio. He moved slowly, building a chain of forts behind him, Fort Recovery, Fort Defiance, and Fort Greenville, each one securing supply lines and denying the enemy safe ground. When Wayne reached the site of St. Clair's defeat, he ordered a fort built there, defiantly naming it Fort Recovery, a symbol of America's determination to avenge the fallen. That summer, his army advanced toward the heart of the native stronghold near the Maumee River, not far from present-day Toledo, Ohio. On the morning of August 20, 1794, Wayne's Legion met the combined forces of the native Confederacy, around 1,500 warriors, in a place where a recent storm had blown down hundreds of trees. It was called Fallen Timbers. Little Turtle, cautious and wise, had warned that the ground was poor for fighting. But Blue Jacket believed the tangled forest would give them the advantage. When the battle began, Wayne's troops advanced with discipline, firing volleys, fixing bayonets, and pushing forward through the chaos of fallen logs and gun smoke. The native warriors fought fiercely but were forced back toward the British-held Fort Miami, expecting help from their old allies. But the British gates stayed closed. No reinforcements came. Cut off and outnumbered, the Confederacy's line broke. Wayne ordered a final charge, and within an hour, the battle was over. The defeat shattered the native alliance and ended British hopes of maintaining control over the Northwest. A year later, in August 1795, the surviving native leaders met with General Wayne at Greenville, Ohio, to sign a peace treaty. Under the Treaty of Greenville, the tribe ceded most of what is now Ohio, along with parts of Indiana, to the United States. In return, they received goods worth $20,000 and the promise, soon broken, that their remaining lands would be respected. For the young American Republic, it was a turning point. The Northwest Territory was open to settlement, leading to a flood of pioneers, towns, and eventually, new states. For the native nations, it marked the beginning of a long, painful decline in the Ohio Valley, a loss of land, autonomy, and power that would echo for generations. The Northwest Indian War was one of the most significant yet least remembered wars in American history. It was the first real test of the United States Army, the first major campaign of the new republic, and the foundation for America's westward expansion. It was also a tragedy, a clash of worlds that could never coexist peacefully. The victory at Fallen Timbers gave the U.S. government confidence to expand westward, but it also set a precedent. Treaties made under pressure, native nations pushed further west, and frontier conflict repeating again and again in the Old Northwest, the Great Plains, and beyond. For General Anthony Wayne, the victory made him a national hero. For Washington, it secured the frontier and proved that the United States could defend itself. And for the native leaders, Little Turtle, Blue Jacket, and their people, it was the beginning of an era of dispossession and sorrow. Yet, their courage and unity in the face of overwhelming odds remain one of the most remarkable chapters in early American history. The Northwest Indian War ended in 1795, but its legacy lived on. It taught America painful lessons about leadership, discipline, and diplomacy. It showed that victory on the frontier required more than numbers. It demanded patience, resolve, and respect for the land and people who inhabited it. From the ashes of defeat at St. Clair's battlefield to triumph at Fallen Timbers, the United States emerged stronger, more unified, and ready to expand. This was the moment when the young republic truly began to push beyond the mountains. When America turned its face toward the western horizon. And a new chapter of history began.